Hi there. Tonight we step back in time, far from the gentle hum of your air conditioning, to a world shrouded in flickering candlelight and whispering shadows. Imagine the scent of damp earth and wood smoke clinging to rough wool as you trudge through a muddy medieval village. The air is thick with superstition, every creaking branch, every inexplicable illness, a potential sign of unseen forces at play. You're living in a time when the line between folk wisdom and dangerous magic is gossamer thin, and a wrong word, a misunderstood glance, could lead to accusations that change your life forever. In this landscape, where knowledge is scarce and fear is abundant, even a perfectly innocent herb garden could be mistaken for a witch's brew. You probably wouldn't survive a week, let alone thrive, without accidentally offending some local spirit or stepping on a cursed cat. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and if you're feeling up to it, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're going to explore what happened to medieval women accused of witchcraft, a story often sensationalized but rarely understood in its quiet, chilling reality. The medieval period, roughly spanning from the 5th to the 15th century, was a time of immense transformation across Europe. It was a world grappling with the decline of the Roman Empire, the rise of new kingdoms, and the slow, inexorable spread of Christianity. For centuries, across countless scattered hamlets and burgeoning towns, daily life was inextricably woven with a rich tapestry of beliefs concerning the supernatural. Before the formal church doctrine really took hold, many communities still held on to older, pagan traditions. Think of ancient deities fading into the mists, transforming into local spirits, fairies, or even household sprites that might help or hinder your chores. People believed in the power of charms, amulets, and simple folk remedies passed down through generations. If your cow fell ill, you might seek out the village wise woman. Not for her medical degree, they didn't have those, obviously, but for her knowledge of herbs and her connection to the unseen forces that governed health and sickness. This wasn't necessarily seen as witchcraft as we might understand it today. It was simply part of the fabric of life, a way to navigate an often harsh and unpredictable world. Historians still argue whether these early practices were truly distinct from later accusations of maleficium, or if they simply provided fertile ground for fear to take root. These practices, you see, were often benign acts of healing or protection. If you were a peasant, living hunt-boomed through, reliant on the whims of the weather and the health of your livestock, you'd try anything to ensure survival. A small ritual to bless the harvest, a specific prayer whispered over a sick child. These were acts born of desperation and hope, not malice. There was a sort of spiritual fluidity, where the sacred and the mundane often intertwined. You might attend Mass on Sunday, but still leave an offering of milk for the sprites by your hearth. This cultural cocktail, this blend of nascent Christian theology with deep-seated animistic and folkloric traditions, set the stage for how future accusations would unfold. The very ambiguity of these beliefs, the way they shifted and blurred at the edges, would later become fertile ground for suspicion. It's almost like trying to define a specific type of cloud when you're looking at a whole sky full of them. It depends on where you stand and what you're looking for. And unfortunately, for many, what people started looking for was trouble. As the centuries wore on, however, The church's influence wasn't just growing, it was consolidating, expanding its reach into every corner of medieval life. From grand cathedrals rising majestically in cities to humble parish churches nestled in rural villages, the cross became a central symbol of authority, both spiritual and, increasingly, temporal. This wasn't just about faith. It was about power, order, and bringing a vast, disparate continent under a unified worldview. The Church, in its efforts to establish a coherent doctrine and eliminate rival belief systems, began to scrutinize and often demonize these older folk practices we just discussed. What was once seen as quirky, local custom or a slightly unusual way of asking for divine favor started to be recategorized as something darker, something heretical. Imagine, for a moment, the shift. It's like your quirky uncle who has a slightly odd way of doing things. For years, you just roll your eyes and chuckle. But then, a new family leader comes along and declares that your uncle's odd habits are not just eccentric, but actually dangerous to the family's reputation and well-being. Suddenly, what was harmless becomes suspect. This is what began to happen with the Church and its perception of pagan survivals and folk magic. They saw a need to define what was orthodox, the true path, and what was heterodox, or outside, of accepted teaching. This often meant labeling anything that didn't fit neatly into Christian theology as inherently evil, or at the very least, potentially influenced by demonic forces. The distinction between a miracle, a natural phenomenon, and a magical act became critically important to theologians. A miracle was an act of God. A natural phenomenon was, well, nature doing its thing. But magic was trickier. If it wasn't God's work, and it wasn't nature's work, whose work was it? The prevailing theological answer began to lean heavily towards the devil. This wasn't a sudden, overnight transformation, mind you. It was a gradual process, spanning centuries, with theologians and scholars debating the nature of evil, the power of Satan, and the extent to which humans could willingly collaborate with malevolent entities. Historians still argue whether the Church truly believed in widespread demonic pacts from the start, or if the initial focus was more on the superstition of the common people. Early Church fathers, like Augustine of Hippo, way back in the 4th and 5th centuries, laid some groundwork by condemning various forms of divination and charm-making. However, his view, and that of many early medieval thinkers, often attributed magical effects to either divine intervention, God allowing it to happen, for a reason or two, demonic illusion, the devil making you think something happened when it didn't, or tricking you into sin. It wasn't always about humans having inherent magical power, but as the centuries progressed, particularly from the 12th and 13th centuries onwards, the idea of a direct pact with the devil began to gain more traction in theological circles. This was a significant shift, no longer just a matter of naive superstition. Engaging in certain magical practices could now be interpreted as a direct renunciation of God and an allegiance to evil. And this, my friends, was a fast track to serious trouble. It transformed a local cunning woman who healed warts into someone potentially conspiring with the ultimate enemy. This rising theological framework provided the intellectual justification for what would eventually become the witch trials. With the Church's theological framework solidifying, the concept of witchcraft began to take on a much more sinister and dangerous definition. It wasn't simply about someone casting a love spell or finding a lost item anymore. The emerging view, particularly from the 13th century onwards, started to fuse the idea of heresy with magical practices. Heresy, in simple terms, was any belief or doctrine that contradicted the official teachings of the Church. And by this point, heresy was considered one of the gravest sins, often punishable by death. So, if you were performing some kind of ritual, even if you thought it was for good, and it wasn't sanctioned by the Church, you could quickly find yourself in deep trouble. The accusation could shift from she's using strange herbs to she's denying God and worshipping the devil. Think about it. This was an era before widespread scientific understanding. If a crop failed, or livestock died, or a child fell ill, and there was no obvious physical cause, people looked for a supernatural explanation. And with the Church actively promoting the idea of a spiritual battle between good and evil, with the devil always lurking, it became very easy to point a finger at a neighbor who seemed different, or who had an argument with the victim recently. The legal and theological definitions of what constituted witchcraft began to crystallize, often overlapping significantly with the definitions of diabolism, the worship of the devil. This wasn't just folk magic. This was now seen as a deliberate, conscious rejection of Christianity and an allegiance to Satan. The idea of a demonic pact, where an individual would voluntarily give their soul to the devil in exchange for earthly power or favors, became a central tenet of this new understanding of witchcraft. This elevated the crime from a mere local misdemeanor to a cosmic betrayal. Historians still argue whether the concept of the demonic pact was genuinely believed by the general populace, or was primarily a construct of learned theologians and inquisitors. For medieval society, the stakes were incredibly high. If someone in your community was making a pact with the devil, it wasn't just their soul at risk. It was potentially the safety and spiritual well-being of the entire village. A witch, in this emerging definition, was not just someone who could cause harm through magical means known as maleficim, but someone who was an enemy of God, and therefore an enemy of all good Christian people. They were seen as agents of chaos, actively working to undermine the divine order. This fear, this deeply ingrained belief in an active, malevolent, supernatural enemy, created a fertile psychological ground for suspicion and fear to flourish. This new, formal definition meant that the punishments became incredibly severe. If you were found guilty of heresy, and now witchcraft was increasingly seen as a form of heresy, the typical punishment was to be handed over to the secular authorities for execution, often by burning at the stake. This wasn't just to punish the individual, but to cleanse the community of evil and serve as a terrifying warning to anyone else contemplating dabbling in forbidden arts. The meticulous theological treatises and legal manuals that emerged during this period laid the intellectual foundation for the centuries of witch trials that would follow, transforming a nebulous fear into a systematic, brutal pursuit. It's like drawing a clear, red target around something that used to be a blurry spot on the horizon. And unfortunately for many, that target was painted right on their backs. So, with this increasingly severe definition of witchcraft taking hold in the minds of theologians and legal scholars, it wasn't long before accusations began to trickle down into the everyday lives of ordinary people. These weren't grand, organized inquisitions targeting vast covens at first. Instead, the sparks often ignited in small, tight-knit communities, your average medieval village or market town, where everyone knew everyone, and grudges could simmer for years beneath a veneer of neighborly civility. Imagine you're living in one such village. Life is hard, predictable in its hardship. The harvest is everything. The health of your family and your animals is paramount. Then, something bad happens. Your cow, your very livelihood, suddenly falls sick and dies. Or your child develops a mysterious wasting illness. Or perhaps your butter just won't churn properly, no matter how hard you work it. In a world without scientific understanding of germs or disease, and with a deeply ingrained belief in unseen forces, what do you look for an explanation, something tangible to blame? And sometimes, that explanation landed squarely on the shoulders of someone nearby. Accusations often stemmed from mundane disputes that escalated, fueled by fear and suspicion. Perhaps you had a heated argument with your neighbor, Agnes, over a shared property line or a stray pig. A few days later, your chickens stopped laying eggs. Could it be a coincidence? Or could Agnes, still seething from your quarrel, have bewitched your flock? This wasn't always about grand, evil rituals. Sometimes it was as simple as the belief that someone with ill will could cast a maleficium, a harmful spell, through a look, a word, or a simple act of malice. This concept of maleficium was central to many early accusations. The idea that an individual could cause misfortune, illness, or even death through supernatural means, often driven by envy or spite. Historians still argue whether these localized disputes were genuinely believed to be supernatural, or if they were merely a convenient pretext for addressing social grievances. The person accused was almost always someone vulnerable or socially marginalized. Think of the old woman living alone at the edge of the village, perhaps a widow without male relatives to protect her. Or the village eccentric, the person who spoke to themselves, or who had an unusual appearance. Someone who didn't quite fit in, or who had perhaps been a bit too outspoken, or who simply refused to conform to social norms. These individuals became easy targets when misfortune struck and a scapegoat was needed. Their existing isolation only made them more suspect in the eyes of their superstitious neighbors. It's almost like a child's game of tag, but instead of a playful tap, the touch of suspicion could lead to something far more sinister. These early accusations weren't always immediately about the devil. They were often about practical, everyday harms attributed to a neighbor's ill will or the misuse of folk magic. But as the church's doctrine on diabolism spread, these local grievances began to be reinterpreted through a more alarming lens. A simple hex on a cow could morph, in the minds of the fearful, into evidence of a much deeper, darker alliance. And once that seed of suspicion was planted, watered by fear and neighborly distrust, it could grow into something truly monstrous. So, who were these individuals making the accusations? It might surprise you to learn that it wasn't always just religious zealots or powerful authorities instigating these claims. Often, the accuser was an ordinary person, a neighbor, a fellow villager, or even a relative who felt wronged or who had experienced some misfortune they couldn't explain. The profile of an accuser could be quite varied, but common threads emerge. They were typically individuals who had recently suffered a loss, a sick child, dying livestock, a failed crop, or even persistent bad luck. In a world where every hardship was potentially seen as divinely ordained or supernaturally inflicted, finding a human cause for their suffering offered a sense of control, a tangible target for their grief and anger. Imagine Mrs. Elara, whose prize milk cow suddenly, inexplicably, gives no milk for days, then sickens and dies. Elara had recently had a spat with old man Theron over a boundary stone. Theron had mumbled something under his breath about her pride. Was it just a coincidence? Or did Theron, known for his reclusive ways and the strange herbs he dried by his window, have something to do with it? the seeds of suspicion were easily sown. It's a bit like when your internet suddenly goes out right after you've complained about your neighbor's loud music. You know it's probably unrelated. But in a moment of frustration, your mind might just leap to wild conclusions. Sometimes, the accusers were people who genuinely believed they had been bewitched. They might experience strange illnesses, sudden pains, or psychological distress that, in their understanding, could only be attributed to a curse. In societies without modern medicine or psychology, the inexplicable often found its explanation in the supernatural. These personal afflictions, combined with a cultural readiness to believe in malevolent magic, could transform a chronic headache into proof of a witch's hex. Historians still argue whether some accusers suffered from genuine psychological conditions or were simply mirroring societal anxieties. It's also worth noting the role of social dynamics in these accusations. Accusers might be people who felt threatened by the accused, perhaps due to social standing, perceived competition for resources, or simply an underlying animosity. If a woman was seen as too independent, too skilled in healing, or too wealthy for her station, she might inadvertently attract envy and suspicion. An accusation of witchcraft could be a potent weapon in community disputes, a way to neutralize a rival or to enforce social conformity. There's a dark irony in the fact that fear could lead to bullying disguised as righteous indignation. The village bully, instead of just pushing you in the mud, could now accuse you of causing their grandmother's gout through dark arts. Furthermore, children, particularly during the later, more intense phases of the witch hunts, could become accusers, often pressured by adults or caught up in the mass hysteria that sometimes gripped communities. Their vivid, imaginative descriptions of specters and tormentors could be taken as undeniable proof, adding a terrifying layer of credibility to the claims. The sheer desperation of loss, combined with a strong belief in the devil's work and simmering social tensions, created a volatile mix where a simple complaint could rapidly spiral into a formal accusation with devastating consequences. Once an accusation of witchcraft was voiced, the process, slow and terrifying, would begin to unfold. But how, exactly, did one prove such an elusive crime? Unlike, say, theft, where you might find stolen goods, or assault, where there's a visible wound, witchcraft left no obvious physical trace, at least not in the conventional sense. This is where the concept of peculiar evidence comes into play. A collection of signs, superstitions, and circumstantial observations that, to the medieval mind, seemed to confirm a pact with the devil. Imagine you are the accused, standing before local authorities, or perhaps an ecclesiastical court. The evidence against you might start with the most innocuous things. Did you have an argument with someone who later fell ill? That's maleficium through ill will. Did you live alone, perhaps with a number of cats? Cats, especially black ones, were often viewed with suspicion, thought to be familiars or demonic companions. Did you have an unusual birthmark, a mole or a wart? These could be interpreted as a witch's mark or even a devil's mark, a spot where the devil touched you or where your familiar might suckle. It's like trying to prove you're not a secret spy just because you own a trench coat and a very large hat. To some, the proof is simply there. One common form of evidence was spectral testimony. This was particularly prevalent in later witch hunts, but had roots in earlier beliefs. An accuser might claim that the accused which appeared to them in a dream or a vision, tormenting them, pinching them, or even trying to suffocate them. While we might dismiss these today as nightmares or hallucinations, In an age deeply immersed in the belief of an active spiritual realm, these visions were taken as literal proof that the witch's spirit or a demon sent by the witch was tormenting the victim. Historians still argue whether spectral testimony was a genuine belief or a convenient tool for conviction when other evidence was lacking. Then there was the unchristian behavior. Did you attend church regularly? Did you recite your prayers correctly? Any deviation from expected pious conduct could be viewed as suspicious. Perhaps you mumbled during Mass or seemed to avoid consecrated ground. Even a simple act of weeping or failing to weep during an interrogation could be twisted. If you cried, you were trying to manipulate. If you didn't, you were hardened by the devil. It was a no-win scenario designed to extract a specific outcome. Finally, and perhaps most chillingly, there was the testimony of other accused witches. Once one person confessed, often under duress, and we'll get to that grim reality soon, they would frequently be pressured to name accomplices. This created a terrifying chain reaction, where one forced confession could lead to dozens of new accusations, as the accused, desperate to alleviate their own suffering, would name anyone they had a grudge against, or anyone who popped into their panaddled mind. It's a bit like being told, "Tell us who else ate the last cookie, or you'll get all the blame." Except, the cookie here was an accusation that could lead to your demise. The very nature of the crime, being unseen and spiritual, demanded unusual, and often illogical forms of proof, paving the way for truly dark chapters in history. With accusations swirling and peculiar evidence mounting, the medieval legal system, or what passed for it, needed a way to formally determine guilt or innocence when faced with the ethereal crime of witchcraft. This often led to the use of ordeals, ancient judicial practices that predated formal legal codes and relied on divine intervention to reveal the truth. These were not trials in the sense we understand them today, with juries and reasoned arguments. Instead, they were terrifying physical tests, believed to be God's judgment manifested through the accused body. Imagine yourself, accused of witchcraft, being led to one of these ordeals. Your heart would be pounding, not just from fear of the outcome, but from the sheer physical terror of the test itself. One of the most common was the ordeal of cold water, sometimes known as swimming a witch. The idea behind this was rooted in a theological belief. Pure water, having been used in baptism, would reject anything impure or evil. So, if you were suspected of witchcraft, you might be tied, right thumb to left big toe or vice versa, and lowered into a body of water, a pond, a river, or even a specially consecrated pool. If you sank, you were deemed innocent, as the water accepted you. But, and this is the truly grim part, if you floated, you were considered guilty, rejected by the pure water, and presumed to be in league with the devil. The tragic irony, of course, is that if you sank, you often drowned. So, you were essentially damned if you floated, and dead if you sank. A truly elegant system, wouldn't you agree? Another terrifying method was the ordeal of hot iron or hot water. In the hot iron test, you might be required to carry a piece of red-hot iron a certain distance, say 9 paces, or to plunge your hand into boiling water to retrieve an object. Your hand would then be bandaged and examined after 3 days. If the wound was healing cleanly, it was a sign of innocence. If it festering or showed signs of infection, it was divine proof of guilt. Given the lack of sterile conditions and medical knowledge, a clean wound was a rare miracle indeed. Historians still argue whether the outcomes of these ordeals were truly random or if they were subtly manipulated by those conducting the tests. Beyond these more dramatic physical tests, there were simpler, albeit equally superstitious, methods of proof. The pricking test involved searching for the alleged witch's mark, an insensitive spot on the body where the devil was thought to have left his mark, or where a familiar might suckle. Professional prickers would stick needles into moles, birthmarks, or other skin anomalies. If the spot didn't bleed or didn't cause pain, it was taken as proof of a witch's mark. Of course, any good pricker knew how to find a callus or a numb spot. It's almost like a medieval magic trick, where the magician always wins. These ordeals, while seemingly barbaric to us today, were seen as legitimate forms of justice by many, a way for God himself to intervene and reveal the truth. When human means failed, they were deeply ingrained in the cultural and religious fabric of the time, long before the more formalized judicial systems of later centuries took hold. But as beliefs about witchcraft evolved and legal practices became more standardized, these primitive methods would gradually give way to a different, perhaps even more insidious, form of truth extraction, the art of interrogation. As the medieval period progressed, and the Church's influence became more deeply woven into the fabric of daily life, the haphazard methods of determining guilt, such as the ordeals, slowly began to give way to more formalized, though no less terrifying, interrogation techniques. This shift was partly due to the evolving legal systems, which increasingly sought to establish guilt through confession and testimony, rather than relying solely on divine judgment through physical trials. Imagine yourself now, no longer just facing a physical test, but a psychological one. You were brought before an inquisitor, perhaps a local bishop, a secular judge, or even a specially appointed church official. The room is likely dimly lit, perhaps cold, and the air thick with tension. The objective of this interrogation isn't just to hear your story, it's to extract a confession. In the legal thinking of the time, a confession was often considered the queen of proofs, the most irrefutable evidence of guilt. Without it, conviction was much harder, and the means to obtain it could be chillingly persuasive. The methods used were varied, starting subtly but escalating quickly. Initially, an inquisitor might employ psychological pressure. You would be confined, often in isolation, for days or even weeks. Sleep deprivation could become a subtle form of torture, blurring the lines between reality and delusion. You might be repeatedly questioned, with the inquisitor patiently, relentlessly chipping away at your denial, presenting evidence, perhaps that strange mole on your arm, or the neighbor's testimony as undeniable proof of your dark dealings. They would speak of the gravity of your sin, the eternal damnation awaiting you, and the only path to salvation being a full and truthful confession. It's a bit like being stuck in a never-ending conversation with someone who just won't believe your perfectly rational explanation for why you don't have their stapler. Exhausting and ultimately deeply unsettling. They would also use trickery and manipulation. You might be told that an accomplice had already confessed and named you, even if this was a complete lie. Or they might promise leniency for a confession, only to go back on their word once it was obtained. The inquisitors were often highly skilled at reading body language, identifying weaknesses, and applying precisely the right amount of psychological pressure to break a person's resolve. This wasn't about seeking objective truth as we understand it. It was about confirming a preconceived notion of guilt. Historians still argue whether the inquisitors genuinely believed every confession, or if they were primarily driven by a desire for societal order and conformity. As time went on, and particularly with the formalization of procedures by institutions like the Inquisition. These interrogations became increasingly systematic. Manuals would be developed outlining specific questions to ask, how to interpret responses, and what kind of pressure to apply. The underlying assumption was often that anyone brought before them was guilty, and the interrogation was simply the process of getting them to admit it. This created a terrifying environment where silence was interpreted as defiance and denials were seen as further evidence of the devil's hold. The stage was thus set for the darker, more overt methods that would soon become synonymous with witch trials. The polite term for the methods used in medieval interrogations might have been pressure, but the grim reality was often torture, with the belief that a confession was paramount, and the conviction that witches were agents of the devil who wouldn't easily admit their heinous crimes. The use of physical torment became tragically widespread in witch trials, particularly as the fear of witchcraft intensified in the later medieval and early modern periods. It wasn't always a question of visible marks, at least not initially. The aim was to break the will, to make the accused desire relief more than they desired to maintain their innocence. Imagine the stark contrast. One moment, you are trying to protest your innocence with words. The next, your body becomes the battleground. The application of torture was often systematic, escalating in severity until a confession was extracted. One common method, seemingly innocuous but incredibly effective, was strappato. You would be bound with your hands tied behind your back, then hoisted into the air by a rope attached to your wrists, sometimes with weights tied to your feet. This dislocates the shoulders and causes agonizing pain, gradually stretching the limbs. The torment could be increased by repeated drops and jerks. It's the kind of pain that doesn't leave an obvious wound, but shatters nerves and resolve. Historians still argue whether the primary goal of torture was genuine truth-seeking or simply the expedient production of confessions. Another common and equally brutal method was the rack. Here, your body would be stretched by a mechanism that slowly pulled your limbs apart, dislocating joints and tearing muscles. The excruciating pain was designed to make any confession, true or false, seem like a welcome escape. Then there were simpler, yet horrifyingly effective techniques like the thumbscrews or bootykins, which crushed fingers or legs, inflicting intense localized pain without necessarily being immediately fatal. The medieval mind often justified these methods by claiming that the devil fortified his servants against pain, and therefore only extreme measures could force them to speak the truth. It's like trying to get a particularly stubborn jar open and deciding the only way is to hit it with a hammer, even if it smashes the jar. The irony, of course, is that torture rarely, if ever, yielded reliable information. People under extreme pain will say anything to make the suffering stop. They might confess to flying on broomsticks, having intercourse with the devil, attending spots, or causing storms. Whatever outlandish detail their interrogators suggested or implied, these coerced confessions, filled with fantastical elements, then became the proof for subsequent accusations, perpetuating the cycle. The legal systems of the time often had rules about torture. For instance, it couldn't be used immediately, and a confession extracted under torture had to be voluntarily reaffirmed afterward to be valid. However, the accused would often be threatened with a return to the torture chamber if they recanted, making the voluntary reaffirmation a grim farce. This system of extracting confessions, built on fear and pain, stands as one of the darkest aspects of the witch trials, revealing the horrific lengths to which humanity can go when gripped by overwhelming fear and a desperate desire for an explanation. Beyond the visible suffering inflicted by torture, there was a deeply unsettling belief that witches bore a physical sign of their unholy alliance. The witch's mark, or devil's mark. This wasn't merely a scar from a fight or a common mole. It was believed to be an indelible brand left upon the witch's body by Satan himself. A private stamp of ownership, or sometimes a spot where a familiar spirit would suckle. The search for this mark became a grim, intrusive, and often humiliating part of the interrogation process. Imagine the scene: you, the accused, stripped bare, your body meticulously scrutinized by a panel of experts, often including local women, sometimes even the infamous prickers. These prickers were individuals who made a living by identifying these supposed marks. The marks themselves could be incredibly varied, which, conveniently for the accusers, meant almost anything unusual on the skin could be interpreted as a sin, a mole, a birthmark, a wart, a scar, an old blister, a patch of discolored skin, or even a flea bite could be pointed to as undeniable proof. It's a bit like playing a game of spot the difference, where every difference means you lose, and the stakes are unimaginably high. The key characteristic of a true witch's mark, in the eyes of the inquisitors, was its insensitivity to pain and its failure to bleed when pricked. So, the pricker would often use a long needle, sometimes specially designed to retract, or a razor-sharp oar, to repeatedly jab at suspected marks all over the accused body. If the spot didn't bleed, or if the accused showed no pain, it was considered absolute proof of guilt. Of course, a skilled pricker could easily find calloused skin, scar tissue, or simply areas less sensitive to pain. And if the needle was designed to retract, it would appear not to bleed even if it had. This was a rigged game, where the outcome was often predetermined by the biases of the interrogators. Historians still argue whether the prickers genuinely believed in the marks, or were simply exploiting the fears of the time for profit. The devil's mark was also believed to be a spot, where the witch had renounced God or where the devil had touched them during their initiation into the unholy coven. This mark was thought to be a sign of the pact, an unspoken contract in flesh. In some accounts, it was even described as a small, raised lump, almost like a nipple, from which the familiar spirit, often in the form of a cat, dog, or toad, would draw nourishment. This added a grotesque, sexualized dimension to the accusations, further dehumanizing the accused. The search for the witch's mark highlights the desperation of the authorities to find tangible evidence for an intangible crime. It was a physical manifestation of a spiritual sin, a way to make the invisible visible. The invasive nature of the examination, often performed in public or semi-public settings, served not only to gather evidence but also to humiliate and degrade the accused, breaking their spirit even before the formal judgment was passed. Was a terrifying fusion of superstition, pseudoscience, and sheer human cruelty, leaving an indelible stain on the history of justice. Once the relentless interrogation and the degrading search for the witch's mark had taken their toll, many accused individuals, pushed to their absolute physical and psychological limits, would eventually do what their tormentors desperately sought: they would confess. But these were not confessions born of truth or genuine remorse. They were often elaborate, fantastical narratives, conjured from the depths of fear, pain, and exhaustion. The goal of the interrogators wasn't just any confession, mind you, but one that fit the increasingly detailed theological and demonological theories about witchcraft. This is where sleep deprivation, physical agony, and psychological manipulation truly blurred the lines between reality and dark fantasy. Imagine days, or even weeks, of relentless questioning, often at odd hours, interspersed with periods of isolation. Your body aches, your mind is foggy from lack of rest, and every denial is met with scorn or the threat of renewed torment. In this state, your grip on reality begins to fray. The inquisitors, steeped in their manuals of demonic lore, would subtly, or not so subtly, feed you details. Did you meet the devil? What did he look like? Did he give you a mark? Did you fly through the air? Did you attend a gathering of other witches? These questions, repeated endlessly, begin to plant seeds in your exhausted mind. It's like someone whispering a story to you over and over while you're half asleep. Eventually, parts of it start to feel real, or at least feel like the easiest path to silence the voice. The confessions that emerged from this crucible were often remarkably similar, reflecting the prevailing beliefs about witchcraft rather than individual experiences. They spoke of demonic pacts, signed in blood or through ritual. They described nocturnal flights through the air, sometimes on broomsticks, sometimes on the backs of animals, to attend Sabbats' secret, unholy gatherings of witches. At these Sabbats, the accused would detail dancing wildly, feasting, and engaging in perverse sexual acts with demons or the devil himself. They might confess to renouncing God, trampling on the cross, or spitting on sacred images. They would name other witches present, creating a terrifying ripple effect of new accusations. Historians still argue whether these detailed confessions were entirely fabricated by the accused or if they contained distorted elements of pre-existing folk beliefs. Consider the sheer psychological strain. Your mind, desperately seeking an escape from unimaginable suffering, might latch onto any narrative that offers respite. If admitting to flying on a goat makes the pain stop, then suddenly you remember flying on a goat. If naming your neighbor, Martha, means you might get a moment's peace, then Martha becomes a fellow witch. These confessions, once extracted, were then meticulously recorded, often presented as undeniable proof of the devil's pervasive influence, reinforcing the very fears that fueled the trials. The more outlandish the confession, ironically, the more it seemed to validate the inquisitors' theories about the depths of satanic depravity. The accused were trapped in a horrifying loop: deny and suffer, or confess to impossible crimes and be condemned. It was a no-win situation where the truth was whatever the authorities wanted it to be. Within the tapestry of these coerced confessions and the demonological theories that fueled them, a particular concept loomed large: the familiar, not just a friendly pet. A familiar, in the context of witchcraft, was believed to be a demonic spirit in animal form, gifted by the devil to a witch. This familiar would act as a spy, a messenger, and often an agent of the witch's maleficium, carrying out curses and bringing harm to victims. The belief in familiars was especially prevalent in the witch trials of England and Scotland, though variations existed across Europe. Imagine a lonely, isolated woman, perhaps talking to her cat or dog for companionship, a perfectly normal human behavior. But in a climate of intense suspicion, that innocent act could be twisted into something sinister. Her beloved Tabby, in the eyes of the fearful community, wasn't just a feline. It was a demonic servant. These familiars were often described as small, common animals. Cats, especially black ones, of course, dogs, toads, weasels, mice, or even insects. Sometimes they were said to appear as more exotic creatures, or even as small, hairy, undefined imps or sprites. It's like when your elderly aunt talks to her plants. In a normal setting, it's endearing, but in the fevered imagination of a witch hunt, those plants might be whispering dark secrets back. The familiar was believed to be an integral part of the witch's power. It was thought that the witch would offer a drop of her blood to the familiar, often from a hidden witch's mark or an insensitive spot, to sustain it. In return, the familiar would assist the witch in her magical operations, carrying out tasks like making milk curdle, causing illness, or bringing bad luck. Confessions often included detailed, sometimes bizarre, accounts of these interactions. Accused witches, under torture or extreme duress, might describe feeding their familiars their own blood or sending them out on errands of mischief and destruction. Historians still argue whether the concept of familiars was a genuine folk belief, distorted by inquisitors, or a purely theological construct imposed upon the accused. The search for a familiar could become part of the physical examination. Investigators would look for any unusual marks on the accused body, moles, warts, or other blemishes that could be interpreted as a teat or sucking place where the familiar drew nourishment. This again highlights the desperate need for tangible evidence for an intangible crime, creating a perverse logic where common bodily features became damning proof. The role of familiars added another layer of fear and horror to the accusations. It wasn't just that a witch could cause harm. It was that she had a direct, tangible link to the demonic realm, a visible or invisible to others helper in her nefarious deeds. This belief served to further isolate and dehumanize the accused, transforming them from ordinary individuals into monstrous figures surrounded by an unseen retinue of evil. It solidified the image of the witch as someone utterly estranged from God and human society, justifying the extreme measures taken against them. If the idea of familiars solidified the witch's connection to the demonic, then the concept of midnight gatherings, the infamous Sabbats, truly painted the picture of a vast, organized conspiracy against God and humanity. These were not just isolated acts of maleficium. They were believed to be mass assemblies where witches from far and wide met to worship the devil, plan their nefarious deeds, and engage in perverse rituals. The descriptions of these Sabbats, often extracted from the tortured confessions of the accused, were remarkably consistent across different regions, influenced heavily by demonological treatises. Imagine, if you dare, what an accused person, broken by days of interrogation and torture, might remember about such an event. They would describe flying through the night, often on broomsticks, pitchforks, or even the backs of grotesque beasts. The journey itself was part of the magical experience, a terrifying, exhilarating defiance of natural law. Upon arrival, they would find a large assembly of fellow witches, often in a remote, desolate location, a dark forest clearing, a desolate mountaintop, or even a ruined church. It's a bit like a twisted, infernal office party. But instead of stale coffee and awkward small talk, you get goat-headed demons and unholy oaths. At the heart of the Sabbat was the worship of the devil. He was often depicted in animalistic forms, most famously as a goat-headed figure or a large black man. Witches would pay homage to him, kissing his posterior, the infamous osculum, in fame, and renouncing their baptism and Christian faith. This ritual apostasy was central to the concept of the demonic pact. Confessions detailed blasphemous ceremonies, mock masses, and the desecration of sacred objects. The attendees would feast on unholy banquets, sometimes said to be composed of human flesh or unbaptized infants. Historians still argue whether the concept of the Sabbat was purely a theological construct or if it drew upon distorted elements of ancient pagan festivals or folk gatherings. Beyond the worship, the Sabbat was also believed to be a place of unrestrained revelry and perverse sexual acts. Witches would dance wildly, often naked, to the sound of infernal music. Sexual intercourse with demons, or even with the devil himself, was a common theme in these confessions, reflecting the era's anxieties about female sexuality and control. These descriptions served to further demonize the accused, making them seem utterly depraved and deserving of the harshest punishments. The moral panic about the spread of witchcraft was often intertwined with fears about societal decay and the breakdown of traditional norms. The very idea of the Sabbat transformed witchcraft from a localized problem of individual maleficium into a vast organized threat to Christendom. It implied a hidden army of Satan's followers, conspiring in secret to undermine religious and social order. These detailed, horrifying accounts, extracted under duress, became self-fulfilling prophecies, reinforcing the authorities' belief in a widespread demonic conspiracy and fueling the relentless pursuit of more witches who could attend these unspeakable gatherings. The more confessions that included such details, the more real the Sabbats became in the public imagination, creating a terrifying feedback loop of fear and condemnation. In a world constantly battling illness and misfortune, the lines between helpful healing arts and harmful curses could become dangerously blurred. For centuries, long before formalized medical professions, communities relied on traditional healers, often women who possessed knowledge of herbs, poultices, and ancient remedies passed down through generations. These women, sometimes called wise women, cunning folk, or charmers, were integral to village life, providing comfort and relief when sickness struck or when a child was born with a difficult ailment. Their practices often blended practical herbalism with folk magic, prayers and rituals, a gentle mix that was once accepted, even valued. Imagine a situation. Your child is burning with fever. The nearest proper doctor is days away, if one exists at all. Who do you turn to? The local wise woman, of course. She knows which roots to boil for a cough, which poultice will draw out infection, and perhaps a specific rhyme to ward off evil spirits thought to cause illness. This was not viewed as inherently malicious. It was a form of community care, a desperate attempt to exert some control over the terrifying unpredictability of disease and injury. It's like today, when you get a cold, you might take some over-the medicine, but also drink your grandma's special ginger tea, a blend of modern and traditional, accepted without question, however. As the fear of witchcraft intensified and the Church's definitions of magic became stricter, this delicate balance began to tip precariously. The very knowledge that made these women respected healers could, with a twist of perspective, become evidence of something sinister. If your healing remedy worked, it was a blessing. If it failed, or if the patient worsened, that same remedy could be reinterpreted as a curse or proof of maleficium. The line between cunning folk who healed and witches who harmed became dangerously thin, especially when misfortune struck and a scapegoat was needed. Historians still argue whether the demonization of traditional healers was a deliberate strategy by the Church, or a natural outcome of pervasive societal anxieties. A simple, practical understanding of herbs could easily be twisted into evidence of illicit knowledge gained from demonic sources. The whispers around the village might start, "She knows too much," or "Where did she learn those secrets?" The same woman who was praised for saving a child could be accused of causing another's death if their healing failed, or if she had a public disagreement with a neighbor who later fell ill. The healing acts were inherently powerful, and in a superstitious age, power that didn't come directly from God as mediated by the Church was suspect. This created an incredibly precarious position for many women who served as healers. Their lives were dedicated to alleviating suffering, yet their very skills could become their undoing. The trust placed in them could easily transform into deep suspicion, especially if a patient died or if a rival in the community wanted to undermine them. The historical irony is profound. Many of the skills and knowledge that had benefited communities for centuries were suddenly rebranded as dangerous, demonic practices, turning benefactors into targets in the escalating witch hunts. One of the most striking and tragic patterns in the history of medieval witchcraft accusations is the overwhelming preponderance of women as targets. While men were certainly accused and sometimes convicted, the vast majority, estimated to be around 75 to 80%, or even higher in some regions, of those persecuted and executed as witches were female. This wasn't accidental. It was deeply rooted in the prevailing societal views, religious doctrines, and gender biases of the era. Imagine living in a society where women, especially those outside the direct control of a husband or father, were already viewed with suspicion. Medieval European society was profoundly patriarchal, with women often seen as inherently weaker, more emotional, and therefore more susceptible to temptation and sin, particularly by the devil. Theological texts and sermons often emphasized Eve's original sin, portraying women as the gateway to evil. The notorious Malleus Maleficarum, or Witch's Hammer, a terrifying manual for witch hunters, explicitly stated that witchcraft was more prevalent among women due to their insatiable carnal lust and their feebleness of mind. It's like a medieval self-help book, but instead of telling you how to be better, it tells you why women are inherently worse. Furthermore, many of the roles women traditionally occupied made them vulnerable. As we discussed, healers and midwives were often the first point of contact for illness and childbirth. If a birth went wrong or a child died, the midwife, through no fault of her own, could become an easy scapegoat. Similarly, women were often responsible for preparing food, managing household ailments, and caring for animals, all areas where misfortune could strike and be attributed to a witch's malice. Then there's the issue of social marginalization. Many of the accused were elderly women, especially widows, who lived alone and lacked the protection of a male relative. They might be poor, dependent on charity, or perhaps just eccentric figures on the fringes of village life. Their isolation, their perceived lack of social standing, and their age made them easy targets. If you're looking for someone to blame for a mysterious misfortune, an old, lonely woman who perhaps mumbles to herself or collects strange herbs is a far easier target than the robust, well-connected head of a powerful family. Historians still argue whether the targeting of women was primarily misogynistic or a byproduct of their roles in healing and domestic life. The accusations also often carried a strong sexual undertone. Confessions often extracted under torture frequently detailed sexual encounters with the devil or demonic familiars, reflecting male anxieties about female sexuality. This added another layer of depravity to the image of the witch, justifying extreme measures against them. It solidified the notion of the witch as not just a harmful individual, but a morally corrupt and sexually deviant one. In essence, women occupied a precarious position in medieval society. Their traditional roles, their perceived inherent weaknesses, and their marginalized status in many communities made them uniquely susceptible to being cast as the embodiment of evil when fear and superstition took hold. The witch hunts, therefore, became a horrifying manifestation of deeply ingrained gender biases and societal anxieties, turning vulnerable women into monstrous figures in the public imagination. In a world without newspapers, radio, or the internet, gossip was the primary communication network, and its power was immense. For medieval communities, tightly knit and often isolated, rumors spread like wildfire, shaping reputations, reinforcing social norms, and, tragically, fueling the flames of witchcraft accusations. The power of a whispered word, a knowing glance, or a subtly spread falsehood could be as devastating as any formal charge, often laying the groundwork long before any official proceedings began. Imagine you live in a small village where everyone knows everyone else's business, and privacy is a luxury none can afford. If a minor dispute arises, perhaps your chickens wandered into a neighbor's garden, or a shared water source becomes muddy, a sharp word exchanged between neighbors could quickly fester. If, a few days later, one of the disputants experiences some misfortune, a cow falls ill, a child gets a mysterious rash, or simply a patch of vegetables withers, that initial quarrel instantly gains a new, terrifying dimension. Someone might whisper, "Remember how Agnes cursed you the other day? Now look what's happened." And just like that, a mundane argument is reinterpreted as evidence of maleficium, a harmful spell cast by an angry neighbor. It's a bit like a medieval social media feed, where every minor disagreement can go viral, but instead of just getting ratioed, you might get burned at the stake. This is where the power of rumor became critically dangerous. Once a rumor of witchcraft began to circulate, it was incredibly difficult to stop. Even if the initial claim was baseless, the fear and suspicion it generated would take on a life of its own. People would recall past disagreements, unusual behaviors, or perceived slights, reinterpreting them through the lens of the current accusation. "Remember when she gave me that strange look last market day? Or she always seemed a bit too quiet to me." These seemingly innocent observations, once tainted by rumor, became proof in the public imagination, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of fear and condemnation. Historians still argue whether gossip was merely a symptom of witch hunts or an active accelerant of them. Social pressure played a huge role. If enough people in a community began to suspect someone, it became very difficult for anyone to defend them, or even to express doubt, without risking being seen as an accomplice, or at least someone who didn't care about the community's spiritual well-being. Conformity was key to survival. Those who stood out, or who were already on the fringes of society, were often the first to be targeted by this collective anxiety. The old widow, the eccentric healer, the woman who argued too much. These were the individuals whose reputations could be most easily damaged by circulating whispers. In essence, gossip and rumor acted as a pre-trial, a court of public opinion that often condemned individuals long before they ever stepped foot in a formal courtroom. This informal but immensely powerful social network created an environment where suspicion could fester and grow unchecked, turning neighbor against neighbor and transforming minor grievances into accusations with life or death consequences. The whispered fear, amplified by communal anxieties, often provided the initial spark that ignited the official machinery of the witch trials. The relentless spread of witchcraft accusations, fueled by gossip and theological fear, didn't just target individuals. It ripped through the very fabric of medieval society, creating deep and often irreconcilable community divisions. Imagine a tightly knit village where everyone relied on each other for survival, suddenly fractured by fear, suspicion, and the desperate need to find a scapegoat for misfortune. The witch hunts transformed neighborly bonds into bitter animosities, turning once cohesive communities into cauldrons of paranoia. Think about it. One day, you're sharing a meal with a neighbor. The next, their child falls ill, and they start to suspect you. Or perhaps you suspect them. This wasn't just a personal dispute. It became a public spectacle, often played out in front of the entire community. Accusations forced people to choose sides. Do you defend your elderly aunt, knowing that by doing so, you might draw suspicion upon yourself? Or do you join the chorus of accusers, hoping to protect your own family from the perceived demonic threat, or perhaps to settle an old score? It's a bit like a particularly nasty neighborhood watch meeting, where suddenly everyone is pointing fingers, and the consequence isn't just a fine, but a fatal accusation. These divisions could become particularly acute when accusations involved influential members of the community, or when multiple families became entangled in a web of blame. Families could be torn apart, with accusations even being made between spouses or against children, particularly in later, more intense phases of the witch hunts. The need to cleanse the community of evil often overrode family loyalty and established social bonds. Historians still argue whether some accusations were primarily driven by land disputes or other economic factors disguised as religious zeal. The legal proceedings themselves, whether inquisitorial or accusatorial, brought these divisions into stark public view. Villagers would be called upon to testify, either for or against the accused. This formalized the internal conflicts, forcing individuals to publicly declare their allegiances and reveal their suspicions. Those who offered testimony against an accused which might be hailed as righteous defenders of the community. Those who tried to speak in their favor might find themselves viewed with suspicion, their own piety questioned. The entire process created an atmosphere of profound distrust, where charity and compassion often withered under the harsh glare of collective fear. Furthermore, the economic consequences of accusations added another layer of division. If a witch was convicted, their property was often confiscated, sometimes enriching the accusers or local authorities. This created a perverse incentive for false accusations, exacerbating the rifts within communities, as some benefited directly from the downfall of others. The legacy of these divisions could last for generations, poisoning relationships and leaving deep scars on the collective memory of villagers. The witch hunts, far from uniting communities against a common evil, often turned them inward, consuming them from within through fear, suspicion, and a devastating breakdown of trust. While the fear of witchcraft spread across Europe, the actual legal procedures used to prosecute alleged witches were far from uniform. There was no single, continent-wide witch trial handbook in the early medieval period. Instead, a complex patchwork of local customs, regional secular laws, and evolving ecclesiastical church legal practices dictated how accusations were handled. This variety meant that a woman accused of witchcraft in, say, a village in Germany might face a wildly different process and outcome than one accused in a rural English shire or a town in Italy. Imagine the chaotic landscape. One region might still rely on the old ordeals we discussed, the swimming test or hot iron, believing in divine intervention to reveal guilt. In another, a more formalized secular court, perhaps presided over by a local lord or magistrate, would hear testimonies and make judgments based on established regional statutes. In yet another area, the Church's inquisitorial system, with its emphasis on extracting confessions and investigating heresy, would dominate. It's a bit like trying to navigate traffic laws across different countries without a map. The rules keep changing, and you never quite know what to expect. In England, for example, witchcraft trials largely remained within the realm of common law courts. While the fear of witches was real, English law, at least initially, was somewhat more reluctant to employ torture as widely or systematically as on the continent, though psychological pressure and even physical coercion was certainly present. Accusations often required demonstrable harm maleficium, rather than just a demonic pact. The evidence often relied on witness testimonies of specific harms caused by the accused. The process would typically involve a grand jury bringing an indictment, followed by a trial jury. Historians still argue whether the less frequent use of judicial torture in England led to fewer convictions than in continental Europe, or if other factors were more significant. Conversely, on the European continent, particularly in regions influenced by the Holy Roman Empire and the spread of the Inquisition, the legal procedures often took on a much more systematic and brutal form. The inquisitorial process, distinct from the accusatorial system, placed the burden of proof heavily on the accused. It focused on proactive investigation by the authorities, with the primary goal of securing a confession. Here, judicial torture became a formalized, if legally constrained, tool to extract that queen of proofs. The detailed demonological theories, especially those popularized by texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, heavily influenced these continental courts, leading to a much stronger emphasis on the demonic pact and attendance at sabbats, rather than just practical harm. The variations also extended to punishments. While burning was common for convicted witches on the continent, particularly if the charge was framed as heresy, in England, convicted witches were often hanged, as witchcraft was considered a felony rather than pure heresy under common law. This diverse legal landscape meant that the fate of an accused woman could depend as much on her geographical location and the specific legal traditions of that region as it did on the evidence against her. This decentralization meant that there was no single peak of witch trials across Europe. Rather, waves of intense persecution would rise and fall in different areas at different times, reflecting the unique interplay of local fears, legal structures, and religious zeal. Amidst the escalating fear and brutal legal processes, it's easy to assume that every accusation inevitably led to conviction and execution. However, even in the darkest periods of the witch hunts, not all voices were silenced. Slowly, hesitantly, judicial doubts began to emerge among some legal professionals, theologians, and even secular rulers. These doubts weren't necessarily born of enlightened skepticism about the existence of witchcraft itself, but rather concerns about the reliability of the evidence, the fairness of the procedures, and the sheer number of false accusations that seemed to be surfacing. Imagine a conscientious judge, perhaps, or a skeptical legal scholar, observing the proceedings. They might see confessions that were wildly inconsistent, or stories extracted under torture that seemed utterly fantastical, defying logic and even the very demonological theories they were supposed to confirm. How could so many people confess to the exact same improbable acts? How could a person not confess when subjected to such unimaginable pain? These questions, quiet at first, began to chip away at the absolute certainty that fueled the trials. It's like watching a magic show where the trick is so obvious you start to wonder if the magician is even trying anymore. One major point of contention was the reliability of confessions obtained under torture. Legal theorists, even within the existing framework that permitted torture, often stipulated that a confession had to be freely and voluntarily reaffirmed after the torture had ceased. If the accused immediately recanted once the pain stopped, it cast doubt on the confession's veracity, while many accused were pressured back into reaffirming their confessions. The very existence of this rule indicated an underlying awareness that pain could produce lies, not truth. Historians still argue whether the legal safeguards against false confessions were genuinely intended to protect the innocent, or primarily to maintain the appearance of justice. There were also doubts about spectral evidence. As the witch hunts intensified, especially in places like New England, accusations often relied heavily on victims claiming to see the accused spectre tormenting them. How could one prove or disprove such an intangible claim? If a person's spirit could act independently of their physical body, could innocent people be implicated by demonic illusion? This philosophical quandary led some legal minds to question the validity of spectral testimony as solid evidence. Furthermore, some learned individuals began to argue against the very concept of the demonic pact or the physical reality of sabbats. They suggested that these were mere illusions created by the devil to tempt Christians, or the product of melancholia and delusion on the part of the accused. The famous Dutch physician Johann Weyer, in his 1563 book De Prestiges Demonum on the illusions of demons, argued that many accused witches were not evil conspirators, but rather mentally ill or deluded individuals who deserved pity and medical treatment, not execution. His work was highly controversial, but represents a significant early voice of dissent. These emerging doubts, however, faced an uphill battle against deeply entrenched fears and the powerful institutional inertia of the witch hunt machinery. Yet, they laid the intellectual groundwork for a slow, agonizing shift in legal and public opinion, eventually contributing to the decline of the worst excesses of the trials. It was a gradual dawning, a faint light in the pervasive darkness, but a crucial step towards sanity nonetheless. For many women accused of witchcraft, the immediate instinct, once suspicion fell upon them, would have been flight. But escaping the long arm of accusation in medieval Europe was often a desperate and near impossible feat. Imagine the terror. Suddenly, your neighbors, your friends, the very community you depend on for survival, turn against you. The whispers grow louder, the stares more hostile. And then comes the official summons, or even the rough hands of local enforcers. Your options, in this pre-modern, highly localized world, were incredibly limited. Firstly, travel itself was fraught with peril. There were no highways, no reliable public transport, and certainly no anonymous credit cards to fund a hasty departure. Journeys were dangerous, expensive, and slow. If you were a poor woman, perhaps a widow or an older woman living alone, you would have almost no resources to fund a meaningful escape. You'd be on foot, vulnerable to bandits, starvation, and the elements. And even if you could travel, where would you go? Every village, every town, had its own local authorities, its own superstitions. Fleeing from one place didn't guarantee safety. It merely meant carrying the fear of accusation to a new, unfamiliar locale. It's like trying to escape a bad reputation in a very small town by moving to another very small town nearby. Everyone still knows your business. Eventually, furthermore, a sudden departure from your home and community could itself be interpreted as an admission of guilt. Why would an innocent person flee? This often reinforced the suspicions of those left behind, confirming their belief that the accused had something to hide, a dark secret that couldn't bear the light of day. It was a vicious catch-22. Stay and face potential torture and death, or flee and essentially convict yourself in the court of public opinion while still risking capture. Historians still argue whether the act of flight genuinely indicated guilt or was simply a rational response to an irrational and deadly accusation. For those who did manage to get away, life would have been one of perpetual vigilance and hardship. They would be forced to live on the margins, constantly looking over their shoulder, fearful of being recognized or of new suspicions arising in their temporary havens. They couldn't simply disappear into a vast, anonymous city, as such cities were still relatively rare and interconnected communities meant news, even exaggerated news, traveled. An official warrant, once issued, could follow them, though its reach was generally limited by the fragmented nature of medieval authority. Ultimately, the act of escape for an accused witch in medieval Europe was less about finding freedom and more about extending a period of grim uncertainty. It was a desperate gamble, often undertaken with meager resources against overwhelming odds. The vast majority of those accused, especially the vulnerable women who formed the primary targets, simply had nowhere to go, no one to turn to, and no means to outrun the shadow of suspicion that had fallen upon their lives. Their best, though often futile, hope lay in facing their accusers, a terrifying prospect that we will delve into next. Even in the face of overwhelming odds and the almost predetermined nature of many witch trials, some individuals, or their desperate families, attempted to seek legal recourse or to appeal their sentences. While certainly rare and often ultimately unsuccessful, these appeals offer a glimpse into the slow, painstaking process by which some forms of judicial skepticism began to take root, however faintly. For an accused woman, appealing a sentence was a monumental undertaking, akin to trying to reverse a mighty river with a small spoon. Imagine you've been convicted. Your confession, extracted under duress, has been reaffirmed. Your community has turned its back. What hope remains? Your only path might be to petition a higher authority, perhaps a regional lord, a king, or in some cases, the Pope or a powerful ecclesiastical court. This was incredibly difficult. Firstly, access to such high authorities was virtually impossible for ordinary peasants, especially women. It would require money, connections, and an understanding of complex legal systems that were far beyond the grasp of most. Often, it would be a sympathetic relative or a rare, courageous legal advocate who would undertake this perilous journey. It's like trying to get an audience with the CEO of a multinational corporation when you can barely afford bus fare. Even if a petition reached the right ears, the grounds for appeal were limited. You couldn't just say, "I'm innocent." The appeal usually had to focus on procedural errors in the lower court's handling of the case. Perhaps the judge had not followed proper legal forms, or the torture used exceeded sanctioned limits, or the confession had not been properly reaffirmed outside of duress. The appeals were less about questioning the existence of witchcraft and more about ensuring that the process of identifying and punishing witches was conducted correctly, according to the laws and theological guidelines of the time. Historians still argue whether these procedural challenges were truly effective in saving lives, or merely delayed the inevitable for many. One notable example, though from a slightly later period of intense witch hunts, is the case of the witch-pricker of warboys in England in 1593. After a conviction and execution, a local landowner, Robert Throckmorton, successfully campaigned to have the legal precedent set by the case overturned, not because he disbelieved in witches, but because he believed the evidence and procedures were flawed. This led to a significant shift in English law, making it more difficult to secure convictions based on flimsy evidence. However, for every rare successful appeal, there were hundreds, if not thousands, that failed. The prevailing belief in witchcraft was so strong, and the fear so pervasive, that higher courts were often reluctant to overturn the judgment of local authorities, especially if it meant appearing to tolerate heresy or demonic influence. An appeal could also be seen as an act of defiance, further cementing the impression of the accused stubborn evil. The very act of appealing, therefore, was a double-edged sword, a desperate last resort that offered a glimmer of hope but often only confirmed the accused's doom in the eyes of their persecutors. When all appeals failed, or when no recourse was possible, the final, horrifying chapter of a witch trial often became a public spectacle. Executions were not hidden away. They were deliberately public events, designed not just to punish the condemned, but to serve as a terrifying warning to the populace. A stark demonstration of the authorities' power and their commitment to purging evil from the community. Imagine the chill that would run through you as you were forced to witness such an event. The air thick with fear and a perverse sense of communal righteousness. The condemned, often having endured weeks or months of imprisonment and torture, would be led through the streets, sometimes in shackles, sometimes forced to wear a humiliating witch's cap or a sign detailing their supposed crimes. The procession would draw crowds, eager, fearful, or morbidly curious. This journey to the place of execution was part of the punishment, a public shaming that stripped the accused of their last vestiges of dignity. It's like a really grim parade, where the main attraction is a cautionary tale, and everyone is silently checking if they've ever accidentally looked at someone funny. The method of execution varied by region and the specific charge. As we touched on earlier, in many parts of continental Europe, particularly where witchcraft was conflated with heresy, the common punishment was burning at the stake. This was seen not just as a means of execution, but as a way to ritually purify the community by consuming the witch's corrupt body and preventing the spread of their evil. The smoke carried their essence away, cleansing the land. The sight, the smell, the screams, all designed to imprint a terrifying lesson on the minds of the onlookers. In England and its colonies, where witchcraft was typically a felony rather than heresy, hanging was the more common method, though no less public or horrifying. The gallows, often erected in a prominent place, became a grim landmark, a constant reminder of the consequences of perceived deviance. Historians still argue whether the public nature of these executions genuinely deterred witchcraft, or merely exacerbated societal paranoia. The atmosphere at these events was complex. There would be genuine fear among the crowd, a sense of relief that evil was being vanquished, but also perhaps a simmering undercurrent of unease, or even pity for the condemned. Preachers would often give fiery sermons, denouncing the witch and reinforcing the righteousness of the proceedings, using the dying moments of the accused to drive home lessons about piety and obedience. It was a macabre form of public theatre, where the moral of the story was written in smoke and suffering. These public spectacles served multiple purposes for the authorities. They reaffirmed the power of the church and the state, demonstrating their ability to control and punish. They solidified the image of the witch as a terrifying enemy, justifying the extreme measures taken against them. And perhaps most chillingly, they coerced the populace into compliance, reminding everyone of the dire consequences of stepping outside the strict boundaries of acceptable belief and behavior. The terrifying sight of a witch on the pyre or gallows was designed to haunt the memories of the witnesses, ensuring that the fear of witchcraft and the consequences of being accused remained a potent force in society. The accusations, interrogations, and eventual executions of women accused of witchcraft didn't just end with the condemned individual. The ripple effects of these trials spread outwards, devastating families and leaving behind a legacy of shame, fear, and profound social ostracism. Imagine waking up to find that your mother, sister, or wife has been accused. Your world, once stable, would instantly crumble, leaving you in a terrifying void of uncertainty and communal suspicion. Firstly, the immediate impact on the family was often catastrophic. The accused property might be confiscated, leaving the remaining family members impoverished and destitute. If the primary breadwinner was accused, the family's economic survival was instantly jeopardized. Children, in particular, faced a grim future. They were often viewed with suspicion, tainted by the perceived evil of their parent. Neighbors might shun them, refusing to trade with them, marry into their family, or even allow their children to play together. The stigma of being related to a witch was a powerful, indelible mark that could follow a family for generations. It's a bit like being labeled that family with the incredibly loud dog. Except instead of annoying barks, it's a demonic pact, and the social consequences are far more severe. Furthermore, the very act of accusation could turn family members against each other. Under duress, an accused which might be pressured to name accomplices, sometimes even implicating their own children or spouses. This created an agonizing dilemma for families. Betray your loved one to save yourself, or stand by them and risk a similar fate. The psychological toll of such choices and the irreparable damage to family bonds would have been immense. Historians still argue whether familial denunciations were genuinely believed by the accusers or were desperate attempts to deflect suspicion. For the surviving family, life became an uphill battle against an invisible enemy: social prejudice. Marriage prospects for children of accused witches could be severely hampered. Daughters might be deemed undesirable as wives, and sons might struggle to find land or apprenticeships. The community, once a source of support, became a source of judgment and exclusion. Simple daily interactions, like attending church or market, could become fraught with silent stares and whispered condemnations. The family's reputation, built over generations, could be shattered overnight, replaced by a dark cloud of suspicion that clung to them relentlessly. In some cases, children of accused witches were even separated from their families and placed in the care of others, sometimes even re-educated to purge them of any perceived demonic influence. This not only added to the family's suffering, but also served as a stark reminder to the wider community of the perceived dangers posed by a witch's lineage. The persecution of witches was, therefore, not just about executing individuals. It was about systematically dismantling the support structures around them, ensuring that the stain of witchcraft permeated through their entire social fabric, leaving an enduring legacy of fear and fragmentation. Beyond the immediate human cost, the witch hunts often had a very tangible and often cynical economic dimension: the confiscation of property. For authorities, whether secular or ecclesiastical, the conviction of a witch could be financially lucrative, providing a powerful, if unspoken, incentive to pursue and secure guilty verdicts. Imagine the grim math. An accusation leads to a trial. A conviction leads to property seized, filling the coffers of those prosecuting the case. When an individual was accused of witchcraft, their assets, land, livestock, household goods, even coin would often be immediately impounded, or, at the very least, frozen. This was ostensibly to prevent the accused from fleeing with their wealth or to cover the costs of the trial. However, if a conviction was secured, these assets were often permanently confiscated by the state, the church, or the local lord. This was sometimes justified as a form of divine retribution, cleansing the ill-gotten gains of a servant of the devil, but let's be honest, it was also a very convenient way to generate revenue. It's a bit like a medieval parking ticket that, if unpaid, allows the city to take your car, your house, and your prized collection of garden gnomes. This economic incentive could, and did, fuel accusations. While it's certainly an oversimplification to claim that all witch hunts were only about greed, the possibility of financial gain undoubtedly played a role in some cases. A powerful individual might accuse a wealthy neighbor to acquire their land. A local authority, struggling with dwindling funds, might see witch trials as a legitimate, if ethically questionable, source of income. This was particularly true in regions where the costs of prosecution, paying judges, torturers, jailers, and even the prickers were borne by the local community or court, making confiscation a way to recoup expenses and even turn a profit. Historians still argue whether the financial gains from witch trials were a primary driver or merely an unintended consequence of convictions. The confiscation of property wasn't just about large estates. It could affect even the humblest of accused. The few possessions of a poor widow, her meager patch of land, her goat, her tools could be seized, leaving her surviving family with absolutely nothing. This ensured that even if a family member survived the accusation, they were often left utterly destitute and without means of support, further cementing their social ostracism and rendering them completely dependent or completely broken. This economic aspect highlights a darker, more pragmatic side to the witch hunts. While fear, superstition, and religious fervor were undeniable forces, the material benefits reaped from convictions added a chilling layer of self-interest to the proceedings. It reminds us that even in matters of supposed spiritual purity, human venality can often find a way to insinuate itself, turning tragedy into opportunity for those in power. The image of the witch became not just a spiritual enemy, but also, for some, a walking, breathing potential source of revenue. While the witch hunts raged with terrifying intensity in various parts of Europe for centuries, they did not last forever. Like a fever that eventually breaks, the widespread fervor began to wane, slowly and unevenly, particularly from the late 17th century into the 18th. This decline wasn't a sudden epiphany, but rather a gradual process influenced by a complex interplay of intellectual shifts, legal reforms, and changing social attitudes. Imagine the sheer exhaustion that must have settled over some communities after decades, or even centuries, of accusations, trials, and executions. The constant fear, the turning of neighbor against neighbor, the economic drain of prosecuting cases, all of this began to take a toll. People might have simply grown weary of the paranoia, seeing the destructive impact on their own social fabric. It's a bit like a really long, incredibly stressful group project where everyone ends up hating each other, and eventually someone just says, "Can we please just be done with this?" One significant factor in the decline was the growing skepticism within the legal and intellectual elite. As we touched on, The unreliability of confessions extracted under torture became increasingly apparent. Judges and legal scholars, even if they still believed in the theoretical possibility of witchcraft, began to question the quality of the evidence presented. They saw how easily innocent people could be coerced into confessing to impossible acts, and how often accusations stemmed from personal grudges or delusions. This growing emphasis on due process and verifiable evidence, influenced by emerging legal thought, chipped away at the foundations of witch trial convictions. Historians still argue whether legal reforms were a cause or a consequence of the declining belief in witchcraft. Furthermore, the very excesses of the witch hunts sometimes led to their own demise. In periods of intense persecution, where hundreds were condemned in a short span, a sense of revulsion or doubt could set in. The sheer scale of executions, sometimes including children or highly respected members of the community, could shock people into questioning the legitimacy of the entire enterprise. The famous Salem witch trials in colonial Massachusetts, though a much smaller scale phenomenon than the European hunts, illustrate this point. The escalating accusations and the execution of respected individuals eventually led to a powerful backlash and a halt to the proceedings. The rise of a more centralized state power also played a role. As monarchs and governments consolidated their authority, they often sought to standardize legal systems and reduce the power of local courts, which were often hotbeds of witch trials. A strong central government might view localized witch hunts as disruptive to social order and a challenge to their own judicial supremacy. This didn't mean they disbelieved in witches, but they preferred to control the process, often making it harder for accusations to gain traction. Finally, while the full impact of the Enlightenment was yet to come, the seeds of a more rationalistic worldview were being sown. Scholars and thinkers began to seek natural explanations for phenomena previously attributed to supernatural forces. This intellectual shift, though slow, gradually eroded the cultural and intellectual scaffolding that supported the belief in widespread demonic witchcraft, paving the way for a more skeptical approach to accusations. The age of uncritical belief was, thankfully, slowly coming to an end, while the direct, overt witch hunts were beginning to fade. Their decline coincided with the slow but inexorable rise of the Enlightenment. This intellectual and philosophical movement, primarily in the 18th century, profoundly challenged many of the medieval assumptions that had fueled the witch trials. It wasn't about suddenly disproving the existence of the devil. It was about shifting the framework through which people understood the world, prioritizing reason, empirical observation, and human agency over unquestioning faith and superstition. Imagine a gradual dawning, a slow clearing of the intellectual fog. Instead of immediately attributing every misfortune to a demonic plot or a witch's curse, thinkers began to search for natural explanations. A sick cow, perhaps it's a disease, not a spell. A failed crop, maybe the weather was bad or the soil was poor. This wasn't a universal or instantaneous change, mind you. Old habits of thought die hard, but the seeds of scientific inquiry were being sown, promoting a worldview where phenomena had predictable, observable causes rather than hidden, supernatural ones. It's like replacing your old, temperamental car that only starts when you kick the tires with a new, reliable one that actually has an engine, a far more predictable and understandable system. Key Enlightenment figures, though not all denying the existence of the devil or evil spirits, often argued against the possibility of witches possessing real magical power to influence the physical world. They reasoned that if God was omnipotent and benevolent, He wouldn't allow mere mortals, even those in league with the devil, to subvert his divine plan so easily. Therefore, any perceived magical effects must be illusions or the product of human delusion. This line of argument struck at the very core of what made witch trials plausible. If witches couldn't actually do magic, then the crime they were accused of was fundamentally flawed. Historians still argue whether the Enlightenment's impact was primarily on the elite or if it trickled down to influence popular belief systems. Legal reformers, influenced by Enlightenment ideals, pushed for greater adherence to rational legal principles and protections for the accused. They condemned the use of torture as unreliable and barbaric, advocating for evidence-based trials rather than coerced confessions. Thinkers like Cesare Beccaria, in his influential 1764 work on crimes and punishments, argued vehemently against torture and arbitrary justice, advocating for clear laws and proportionality of punishment. These intellectual challenges to the medieval legal framework directly undermined the procedures that had sustained the witch hunts. Moreover, the Enlightenment fostered a growing emphasis on individual liberty and rationality. The idea that individuals possessed free will and reason made it harder to accept that people could be so easily led astray by the devil, or that mysterious forces could simply override human agency. This shift encouraged a more critical examination of accusations and a greater demand for concrete proof. The witch was no longer just a theological enemy. She became an absurd figure in the light of emerging reason. The slow but relentless tide of new ideas was turning the page on centuries of fear, gradually replacing the whispers of demonic plots with the steady, measured voice of reason. Even after the fires of the witch hunts largely died down and the intellectual currents of the Enlightenment began to reshape legal and societal thinking, the centuries of persecution left a profound and unsettling legacy of fear. This wasn't something that simply vanished overnight. It lingered in the collective memory, shaping folklore, influencing literature, and leaving a deep scar on the historical consciousness of European societies. Imagine the subtle chill that still permeates an old village churchyard, even centuries after the last accusation, a ghostly whisper of past anxieties. Firstly, the most immediate legacy was the trauma for the families and communities that had endured the trials. Generations might pass, but the stigma of having an ancestor accused, or worse, executed, as a witch could persist. Local tales would keep the memory alive, often passed down through hushed whispers. The sites of executions, a particular hill, a town square would retain a grim reputation. It's a bit like knowing your house was built on a very old, very cursed graveyard, even if you never see any ghosts. The history, the feeling of it, just stays. Beyond direct familial impact, the witch hunt cemented certain stereotypes in popular culture. The image of the witch as an old, ugly woman with a black cat, brewing potions and casting curses, became deeply ingrained. This imagery, initially born of fear and demonological theories, continued to populate folktales, children's stories, and even later literary works, perpetuating a somewhat simplified, yet enduring, version of the historical figure. Historians still argue whether the lasting cultural image of the witch primarily served as a cautionary tale or as a means of social control. The trials also contributed to a broader societal distrust of female power and independence. Given that the vast majority of those accused were women, often those who were marginalized, elderly, or who practiced traditional healing, the witch hunts reinforced patriarchal norms. It subtly, or not so subtly, communicated that women who stepped outside predefined roles, or who possessed unusual knowledge were inherently dangerous and suspect. This societal suspicion could linger, even without direct accusations, shaping gender roles for centuries to come. Furthermore, the very real fear of demonic influence and the power of evil, though perhaps no longer focused on individual witches, did not entirely disappear. It simply mutated. The anxieties about unseen forces, moral decay, and societal threats found new outlets, new scapegoats. The witch hunts, in a way, trained societies to look for internal enemies, to attribute complex problems to simple, malicious origins. This inclination to find a single, easily identifiable other to blame for societal ills is a dangerous legacy that unfortunately echoes through history in various forms. Long after the last witch trial concluded. So, while the overt hunting of witches ceased, the underlying currents of fear, the ingrained habits of suspicion, and the chilling stereotypes continued to ripple through the fabric of European society. The shadow of the stake and the gallows, though no longer physically present, remained a powerful symbolic reminder of a time when irrational fear could consume entire communities, leaving a dark and unforgettable mark on the pages of history. Even as the historical witch hunts faded into the past, their echoes continue to resonate in surprising ways, finding expression in modern language, literature, and even our ongoing fascination with the supernatural. The chilling narratives of medieval women accused of witchcraft serve not just as historical footnotes, but as powerful reminders of the dangers of mass hysteria, prejudice, and unchecked authority. Think about how the language of witch hunt itself is still used today. When a politician speaks of a witch hunt against them, they are drawing directly from this dark historical legacy, evoking the sense of an irrational, baseless persecution driven by fear and designed to destroy. This linguistic survival shows how deeply ingrained the archetype of the unjustly accused, the scapegoat, has become in our collective consciousness. It's like using the term Luddite for someone resistant to technology. It immediately conjures a specific, historically rooted image, even if most people don't know the full history of the Luddites themselves. Our enduring fascination with Halloween, with its costumes of pointy hats and broomsticks, is a sanitized, playful nod to a terrifying past. The very imagery of the witch has been transformed from a figure of dread into a playful caricature, a testament to how culture processes and reinterprets historical trauma. But beneath the fun, there's still a faint echo of the older, darker narratives. Historians still argue whether the modern popular portrayal of witches trivializes or subtly preserves the memory of historical persecution. The stories of the witch trials also serve as a powerful cautionary tale about the dangers of conspiracy theories and the ease with which fear can override reason. In an era before widespread scientific literacy, the devil and his agents provided a ready explanation for any misfortune. Today, while we may scoff at literal demonic pacts, the human tendency to seek simple, malevolent explanations for complex problems persists. Whether it's blaming an economic downturn on a hidden cabal, or attributing public health crises to deliberate plots, the underlying psychological mechanisms, fear, the need for a scapegoat, and the desire for control in an unpredictable world, share unsettling similarities with the mindset that fueled the witch hunts. Moreover, the witch trials highlight the profound importance of due process and the protection of individual rights against the power of the state or an inflamed populace. The lack of fair trials, the use of torture, and the reliance on coerced confessions are stark lessons in legal abuses. The fight for legal safeguards, the presumption of innocence, and the right to a fair hearing can, in part, be seen as a direct response to historical injustices like the witch hunts, reminding us that these principles are not inherent but hard-won, and constantly in need of defense as you drift towards sleep. Let these echoes serve as a gentle reminder, not of what we should fear from ancient evil, but of what we should always guard against in ourselves: the easy slide into fear, prejudice, and the willingness to sacrifice truth for the comfort of a simple, often cruel, explanation. As we gently float towards the conclusion of our journey through the shadowy paths of medieval witchcraft, it's essential to draw out the broader historical lessons that these grim narratives impart. These aren't just tales of a bygone era. They are profound insights into human nature, societal dynamics, and the critical importance of intellectual rigor and compassion. The lessons learned from the witch hunts are as relevant today as they were centuries ago, though perhaps in different guises. Firstly, the witch hunts serve as a chilling testament to the dangers of unquestioning belief and mass hysteria. When a prevailing worldview, whether religious, political, or social, becomes so absolute that it stifles dissent and demands conformity, it creates fertile ground for persecution. The medieval belief in an active, malevolent devil, combined with fear of the unknown, allowed accusations to spiral out of control, sweeping up innocent lives in their wake. It teaches us to be wary of any movement or ideology that demands absolute adherence and demonizes those who are different or who raise questions. It's like seeing everyone in a room suddenly jump at a sound only some of them heard. The fear becomes contagious, even if the initial cause is unclear. Secondly, these events underscore the critical importance of critical thinking and verifiable evidence. The reliance on peculiar evidence, spectral testimony, witches' marks, and confessions extracted under torture reveals the catastrophic consequences of abandoning rational inquiry for superstition and confirmation bias. The legal systems of the time, in their desperate attempt to prove an intangible crime, essentially created the evidence they needed, rather than seeking objective truth. This is a timeless lesson. Beware of claims that cannot be tested, and question narratives that demand blind faith, especially when they target specific groups. Historians still argue whether the witch hunts were primarily a religious phenomenon, or a social one driven by economic and political anxieties. Thirdly, the disproportionate targeting of women, particularly the marginalized and vulnerable, exposes the deep-seated dangers of prejudice and scapegoating. The witch became a convenient figure onto whom societal anxieties, misogyny, and economic frustrations could be projected. When communities face hardship or change, there is a natural human tendency to seek an external enemy, a simple explanation. For complex problems, the witch hunts demonstrate how easily such scapegoating can lead to the systematic oppression and brutalization of already vulnerable groups. It's a bit like when your computer crashes and you immediately blame the nearest cat. It's often the easiest target, even if entirely innocent. Finally, and perhaps most hopefully, the eventual decline of the witch hunts, driven by emerging legal skepticism and Enlightenment thought, reminds us of humanity's capacity for self-correction and progress. While slow and agonizing, the shift towards more rational legal systems, a greater emphasis on individual rights, and a scientific understanding of the world ultimately triumphed over fear and superstition. These trials are not just a story of darkness, but also a testament to the enduring power of reason and the persistent, if sometimes arduous, journey towards justice and compassion. As you prepare to rest, Carry with you the quiet power of these enduring lessons. As the medieval dust settles and the echoes of accusations fade, we are left with a quiet, yet powerful, understanding of what happened to medieval women accused of witchcraft. It's a history that reminds us not only of the shadows of the past, but also of the enduring human capacity for both fear and, eventually, reason. The stories of these women, stripped of their sensationalism and seen through the lens of human experience, offer a final, gentle lesson as you drift towards slumber. Their fates, often tragic, underscore the fragility of individual existence. When confronted by overwhelming collective belief and unchecked authority, they remind us that the label of other, particularly when fueled by fear and superstition, can transform a neighbor into a monster, a healer into a malefactor, and an innocent person into a condemned soul. Their stories, pieced together from fragmented records and the cautious interpretations of historians, speak to the power of a narrative, a shared story, however false, to shape reality and dictate destiny. It's a sobering thought, how a whisper can become a shout, and a shout a verdict, but their history also gently whispers of resilience. Even in the face of unimaginable pain and despair, some resisted, some maintained their innocence, and some, through sheer stubbornness, defied the narratives imposed upon them. Their silent struggles remind us of the strength of the human spirit, even when utterly alone against a world consumed by paranoia. They were not all grand figures of defiance, but often ordinary women caught in an extraordinary, terrifying storm. Now, as the last vestiges of our historical journey dissolve, allow your mind to settle. The flickering candlelight of medieval villages gives way to the soft glow of your own resting space. The scent of wood smoke is replaced by the familiar comfort of your surroundings. The whispered accusations are quieted by the gentle rhythm of your own breath. You are safe now, far from the reach of ancient fears and the harsh judgments of a bygone era. Let the details of the past softly recede, like shadows lengthening in the evening light. The lessons remain, but the anxieties of the time do not. Allow any lingering thoughts to simply float away, like leaves on a slow-moving stream. There is only peace here, only the quiet cadence of the night. Feel yourself sinking deeper, heavier, into the softness, into the calm. All the stories are told, all the questions answered, all the history laid bare. Nothing left to do but simply be, drift, now, carried by the gentle current of sleep, knowing that the past is past, and the present is still and warm and safe. Sweet dreams.